of interest at 6:02 p.m. Roll call, Mr. Steele.
Thank you. Commissioner Lamb,
Here.
Commissioner Alexander,
Here.
Vice President Wiseman Ward.
And I know Vice President Wiseman Ward is almost here, so you'll know when she arrives.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Let me begin with the land acknowledgement. We, the San Francisco Board of Education, acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting. I'm going to give a brief introduction and some context, and then we'll have public comment, and then we will have a working meeting and discussion among the board members. So this committee originated from a discussion that occurred at the board meeting of August 22nd of this year, which was our board self-evaluation. And as part of that self-evaluation process, we were using a rubric that has been developed by the Council of Great City Schools. And if members of the public would like to see that rubric, we would refer them to the agenda of August 22nd, where it is posted. And on page 6 is the section entitled Unity and Trust. And as part of that section of the rubric, there's a reference to an ethics and conflict of interest statement. It says, for example, one of the elements on the rubric is the board has adopted an ethics and conflict of interest statement, and all board members have signed the statement during their current term in office. There is a statement in there that says, the board has included language in the statement requiring that board members do not give operational advice or instructions to staff members. The board has included language requiring that board members are responsible for the outcomes of all students, not just some students or students in their region. The board has included language requiring that board members recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations who made campaign contributions to them. And the board has agreed that during the self-evaluation, that board members have honored these boundaries. So there's the statement itself, and then there's the board's evaluation of how it's done, essentially. So the charge of this committee, though, specifically, is to review and possibly edit our ethics and conflicts of interest policy. So we do have a policy. It's quite comprehensive and extensive, and it's included in our board policy. What we did not have, and what this committee is working on developing, is a statement that simplifies and refers to that comprehensive and complex policy. This committee also may, if it chooses, if we decide, make recommendations for revisions to the policy. But the first step is we want to create a document, the statement, as the rubric said, that the board members could sign as an acknowledgement, and board members need to follow the ethics policy regardless of whether they sign anything or not. It's the law. But as a way of sort of acknowledging, we're aware of this, and as a courtesy, frankly, to new board members, also to say this is kind of what our policies are, and to ensure that we're really adhering collectively to these policies. So that's kind of our purpose and framing. And the document, a draft document is posted. This is a very initial draft that we're going to discuss and decide if we want to make edits to, if there's things we need to discuss moving forward before, so this is just an initial starting point that is available to the public. So let's go to public comment. That's kind of the framing, and then we'll go to public comment, and then we'll jump into our board conversation and work.
Thank you, Commissioner Alexander. I do not have any cards in person, and online. Can you sorry, translation, could you please announce that it's public comment for anybody on Zoom if they care to do it right now? Raise your hand.
Buenas tardes. Para aquellas personas que deseen hacer un comentario público, por favor levanten su mano con relación a esta junta. Gracias.
Thank you。大家好，而家係公眾發表意見嘅時段。如果係網上邊位聽眾想發表公眾意見，麻煩你舉手，多謝你。Thank you。
Thank you. Seeing none virtually as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Steele. All right, Commissioner Lamb, let's jump into it. And I'm sure that when Vice President Weitzman-Moore gets here in a minute, she will also engage in our conversation. What I was thinking in terms of process was that we could kind of go through this document and identify issues. We don't have to discuss them all tonight. We can if it's brief and we can figure it out, but so if there's other things that require more in-depth discussion, we can identify them, flag them, and then come back to them at our subsequent meeting if necessary.
Okay.
So in this document basically is a draft. I mean, it attempts to summarize some of the key points of our ethics and conflict of interest policies, pulling from board policy and referring to board policy, which is hyperlinked in the online version. The first paragraph begins by saying the San Francisco Board of Education has been elected by the community to provide leadership and citizen oversight of the district and to ensure that the district is responsive to the values, beliefs, and priorities of the community, which is language pulled directly from Board Policy 9000. Then it says, board members are expected to govern responsibly and hold themselves to the highest standards of ethical conduct. That's from Board Policy 9005. And then it says, this document provides a brief summary of some of the relevant board policies in this area to assist board members in understanding their responsibilities. And at the end, there's another disclaimer that says, please note this document is not designed to be an exhaustive treatise regarding all conflict of interest, laws, or regulations. It is meant to be informational only and does not constitute legal advice regarding these important issues. So again, it's a summary, doesn't include everything. There's sort of the high level issues. No worries, welcome. All right, so is it all right if we just kind of go through it and point by point? So first one, acting in the best interest of every student. Board members' primary responsibility is to act in the best interest of every student in the district. That is from Board Policy 9005. I think it is pretty straightforward. Should I just keep going and you all will stop me if there's stuff you want to talk about? Does that sound good? So number 2, collective responsibility for positive organizational culture. And there's a list. This is also from Board Policy 9005. There's a good list. It's kind of near the bottom, I believe. There's 2 lists actually, and they overlap a little bit. They're at the bottom of policy, at the end of Policy 9005. And so I basically pulled the bullet points and then added a few references to which were in Board Policy 9005, cross-referencing. There's a lot of cross-references in these policies, which is good. So that kind of just summarizes some of the key bullet points. But the big idea there is taking collective responsibility for positive culture and unity. It includes some specific things around confidentiality and other things. Stop me at any point.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
is consistent with how we want to be behaving.
Yeah. Point 3, authority rests with the board as a whole. Now, this is an important one, I think, and that was why. So again, there were places here where in creating this draft, I made some choices about what to pull out. So if there's other things you think should be pulled out or things that maybe shouldn't be pulled out, that's an area also we could talk about. This one I pulled out as a distinct point. It's actually referenced in 2 different policies, 9005 and 9200. But the idea is that none of us, including the board president, as an individual, has authority over the district or administrative responsibility with respect to schools. That we act as a whole, and that the authority rests with the board as a whole.
I just think an overall comment, first of all, thank you
Yeah.
to Chair Alexander for putting a really comprehensive draft and doing that alignment between our current policies into this ethics and conflict of interest. Because I feel like our board policies are pretty comprehensive and rich, and at the same time, not to wordsmith, but I wonder if there's some key pieces that members would be interested to particularly highlight, because if I think if you look at the statement itself, if the public saw it, certainly they would, it's comprehensive, but they would have to click through. So I just
Yep.
wonder if we just want to even pull some language where it's even more prominent. So for example, something that flashpoint for section 2, keep confidential matters confidential, board policy 9011, for example. We are pretty detailed in it, but I think specifically, communication made in closed session, because that's to me, a very clear distinction that's very important around that confidentiality. So that was just one example that I was thinking, would we want to lift out some even more statements within those board policies that we would want in this overall ethics and conflict of interest?
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of conversation I was hoping we could have right now. And so that's a great example. So if Vice President Ward agrees, we could, for example, take that and make it a separate bullet point, right? That's the kind of thing, because again, I made, as in putting together an initial draft, these were just, a first stab at it. So that's exactly the kind of thing. So it sounds like confidentiality is one we maybe want to pull out as a separate bullet point or separate numbered issue. Are there others in that list of under number 2 that you think we should pull out?
Well, yeah, and I'm wondering if maybe it's just the I guess if we're talking, maybe we can talk like go in sections like 3 at a time, because I had a question about 2 and also 3, and I also want to thank you for there's a lot of information in our board policies, and to have it organized in such a clear and concise way is really helpful. So thank you. I also wonder about pulling out a few, and I guess I wonder whether it's about pulling out, or maybe it's another title. So collective responsibility for positive organizational culture. I mean, I do think keep confidential matters confidential is part of organizational culture, but also could be something else. So maybe it's just another thematic header that would go under, and there might be a few others that go under a different header. So it's not so substantive, but just sort of structural.
Yeah, no, and I actually think that's really helpful, because none of this is really substantive, because these are all our policies, right?
Right.
So, and that's what I was struggling a little bit in doing this, was like, well, where do I, and so though it's interesting, because if you look at the policy itself, 9005, it is just like a list.
Mhm.
But I totally agree with you. I think it would be really helpful so I don't know if you have ideas on that, or someone wants to take a stab at it, because we kind of need to. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff in here, and I think some of it is there's some things that could be pulled out for sure.
Yeah, and I think
Combined.
right, combined. So maybe it's after it's sort of looking at all 13 sort of buckets, we can figure out, is there another one that has a sort of thematic
Yep.
range that we can pull some, it's like pulling out, but sort of pulling in or combining. I had one other question about under 2, and then I had a question about the third header. So I know that actually it might have been you and I and when on a commission on a committee where there was a conversation about the use of the word civility.
Oh, yeah.
And so I do want to flag that is also here, and maybe unless if we're defining it, because I don't think the word itself, I think what we're hoping to engender sort of with the term is something clear, but knowing that there is some historical problematic sort of nuanced language that has to do
Yep.
with that word. So just
Yep.
flagging that. One thing that I thought about with the third one, authority rests with the board as a whole, the description, the 2 sentences that follow that make a lot of sense. And I found myself wondering where press came in, in terms of speaking to press, certainly, I mean, there's some governance stuff about speaking to press, but you know, we can't speak, you can speak as an individual, but not being able to speak on behalf of, unless I suppose, I think the president, board leadership can speak on behalf of. Ish, is that right? So,
Yeah, Manuel, do you know if that's in our board policy? I don't remember if that's in our board policies.
So that's a great question, and the answer just conceptually is correct. Board members do not have the legal authority to speak on behalf of the board to the press. They are allowed to speak individually as long as it's very clear from the piece that they're doing that they are speaking on their own behalf. The board president does have the ability to speak on behalf of the board, but even that is limited because it has to be a reflection of the board. You know what I mean? It's not like it has to be a reflection of the board's position, not the president's assumption preemptively of what the board's position is. Like, I mean, there's obviously, depending on, you know, the circumstances, you know, something that comes to mind is like a terrible event. You know, I think that it's safe to say that the board president is free to divine from previous statements that we care about students, we care about safety, that we don't have to have a committee meeting to have, you know, do we care about safety, right? It's not like that. But in terms of like something that is afresh, something new, you know, getting that consensus is really important. So that way the public is not confused about what the position of the board is. In terms of policies, I know that CSBA has something directly on point. If you give me a few seconds, I could probably pinpoint where that would be. Off the top of my head, there's a board policy in the 9000s that talks about the powers of the presidency. And it talks about the powers of the board members individually. So I know, because I've seen it 1,000 times, like it's in those 9000s where it says the board president shall act as the spokesperson. And then it talks about individual board members not having the ability to speak on their own behalf or on the behalf of the
Yeah, and we do have something in 9005 under communication. It does say in communication with community members that individual board members cannot speak on behalf of the board. But I don't know that that's, if there's something distinct on
I thought-
media. Did you find it?
well, I found something about the president. It's 9121 and says it's 9121, president shall perform other duties, but not limited to. And 6 is represent the district as governance spokesperson in conjunction with the superintendent. And then as a reference to CF 1112 media relations. It's board policy 9121. And then if you go down to the paragraph that starts, the president shall perform other duties in accordance with and then 0.6 is represent the district as governance spokesperson. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's just something to flag. Is that something that is appropriate for ethics and conflict of interest? Maybe it's not. I mean, but
Yeah, I think, you know, it's a good question. There were some things where I was getting, it felt to me like they were on the border of whether this is ethics or kind of,
just governance.
yeah, good governance. Because, you know, there's conflict of interest, which Manuel can tell us is very clear legally, right? Can you talk a little bit about that? What's the difference between conflict of interest, ethics, and good governance as you see it?
exactly. I mean, these are number one.
Oops.
I'm sorry. These are all cousins and they are all concepts that are related in the same kind of family, but they do have very distinct roles in their own place in the law. So conflicts of interest speak to the tugging at your heart, tugging at your pocket, right? Situations where a board member finds him or herself having to decide between your financial interests and the interests of the school district. As elected officials, you hold a sacred trust. You are fiduciaries and owe a legal duty to keep the best interests of the district in your decision making. So for instance, if you have to decide between, the money that goes into your pocket vis-a-vis a contract, vis-a-vis your spouse, vis-a-vis a family member, vis-a-vis your property, vis-a-vis your company, these are all competing interests. And so conflicts of interest talk about pecuniary interests, financial interests, and common law interests. Those are what that bucket is about. Ethics have a little bit something else to do in terms of, what tugs at your heart and what pulls you in a different direction. Generally speaking, you're talking about duties like the Political Reform Act, the common law interest. It's not necessarily financial, something that you can measure, but something where it's more kind of foggy, and it has less to do with than perhaps morality. It's not morality. It's more of the, like, are you choosing between the district and something that, again, pulls at your personal interests? You're not putting your personal interests above the interests of the district. And governance are frankly the rules of the road, right? Rules of the road. How do we function as a governmental agency? Because you are a governmental agency. The board sits atop this governmental agency. As a governmental agency, you have vast amounts of resources that you have to oversee. Due process rights and property rights in the form of student education and employee rights. And so staying in your lane, making sure that you're not overstepping your authority and exercise of authority. As a governing board, you exercise both legislative powers, meaning that as a whole, you guys come to a collective census on how to spend resources. And you also exercise quasi-judicial powers. Quasi-judicial powers, again, is the, termination of folks under like certain circumstances where they have due process rights. So again, these all have overlapping touch points, but they are different and distinct.
So I'm gonna then maybe retract my suggestion that based on that really helpful analysis, I do think then that sort of ability and who's talking to the press doesn't then seem to fall within ethics and conflict of interest.
Okay. Anything else on number 2 or 3 that we want to talk about, or anything else on number 2, especially that we want to pull out? We can come back to it if we see other, like you said, other connections, but or should we keep going? Okay, so distinction between board and staff roles. We've talked a lot about this. Again, I think this is good governance, but it is also, ethics in the sense of understanding that we can't individually abuse our power in that sense, right? I mean, that's where there was a little overlap there, right?
Exactly. So where this, and as a lawyer that represents a lot of different educational agencies, I see sometimes where folks get tripped up inadvertently. It's not always on purpose. Sometimes it's something that happens on accident. And this is where the overlap between ethics and governance happens. It's where you are being pulled in different directions to say, look, I have a constituent. Maybe this person helped me on my campaign. Maybe this person is a very vocal supporter in the community of me. They happen to be an employee. They come to me because I'm a board member and they want me to help them with their employment matter. That's not your lane. To interfere, and I'm making an exaggerated example for the point to illustrate the overlap, is that board members are complete. It's an appropriate thing to receive a complaint, pass it on to staff, and then step aside for a whole host of reasons. Number one, ethically, you don't want to be pulled in 2 directions. But legally, you also don't want to assume liability. You actually can make things worse simultaneously for the individual and the board, I'm sorry, and the district, and take on liability and become a witness in the case. A whole host of horribles arise from that. Thus, folks at CSBA, the state level, the board policies, just say, you know, here are the clear rules. If you follow these rules, you will at least avoid some of these tripping points.
So that kind of, though, so I guess actually number 4, 5, 6, and 7 are all kind of connected to that. 4 is the distinction between board and staff roles, in that board members are not managers, and that we only have one employee or 1.5, if we want to call it the general counsel. And then not that you're a half, you're more than a whole actually, but and then number 5, guidelines for communication with staff, so that we're not initiating communication about district business with district staff. Guidelines for information requests, number 6, and guidelines for complaint, number 7. And all these, I would point out, were our former ad hoc committee that revised our board policies created these new policies because we didn't have very clear guidelines. So that work was all done. And this is just sort of, I think, summarizing those.
I'm just looking at a couple other examples of colleagues who are also part of the Council of Great City Schools. And I think how they've been able to capture, and I'm not saying that this is a recommendation I have, but for consideration, because is essentially saying, as a board member that's been, you know, that serves on the San Francisco Board of Education, and as a serving as a commissioner, that I will fulfill my duties in obeying, following the policies of, and that would be all encompassing of, I think, the kind of areas that we just outlined in the distinction roles 4, 5, and 6, and 7. So I don't know, that's something that we could also ponder.
Yeah, that resonates with me a lot, especially given the sort of the breakdown, because I see the way it's currently written, it seems like governance. But if we're tying it into what you were sort of the specific examples, or this is just like we are agreeing to be bound by our governance rules as a matter of not governance, but a matter of like our ethical obligations to this work, then I feel like that it would seem to be logical to frame it that way. So it's not that necessarily getting rid of this, but how do we frame it in a way that ties specifically to ethics and or conflict of interest?
It's also a good, I think, exercise to periodically remind yourselves as board members of what these things are. Right? One that jumps out to me on this issue is on page 1 under section 2. I believe it is, I think it's where it's like basically do your homework. I could be wrong about where I saw that, but it's basically that you agree to show up prepared in terms of the vast amount of information. The reality is that you are members of the community and nobody expects you to be a financier or a lawyer or an educator or, you know, expert in any of these things, but you touch all of it. And that includes governance and ethics, right? And to understand that periodically, to kind of refresh yourselves as a collective, is a good practice. It's a good exercise.
So, Commissioner Lamb, are you suggesting that for like 4 through 7, we somehow shorten them or kind of like frame them differently and just have a list of examples, or what were you thinking? Or both of you? Maybe I couldn't tell if you were saying the same thing or different things.
Well, I'm happy to, I think I was saying the same thing. So if you want to, do you want to leave?
Go ahead.
It seems like it could be, if I'm understanding and agreeing with what I think I understand, that it's more of, you know, we agree that we have an ethical responsibility to comply with the governance procedures established in sections blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. can I say blah, blah, blah? But in sections and then sort of refer to our,
And would we include what those things were, or more just like a general overview of like guidelines for communication with staff, guidelines for information requests in section blah, 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 guidelines for complaints in section blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean?
well, I guess if we're referring to the our governance standard, it seems odd to only reference a few of them. So I feel like we either have to reference them
Mm.
like generally or list all of them, which then might be like a lot, but.
And this was, and the reason I'm asking, not to like be nitpicky about it, but I do think it's, one question is like, how high level should this document
Yeah,
be,
right.
right? So overall,
Mhm.
so that's kind of why I was asking. I don't know what the right answer is, but yeah.
I think if that was, there's two parts to that, I think. Number one, that's, I think, the spirit behind the footnote that Commissioner Alexander read at the beginning of the meeting, where it says this wasn't designed to be an exhaustive treatise. But perhaps, you know, and I think another point that I heard at the beginning of Commissioner Alexander's opening remarks was perhaps this also serves as a starting point for new board members, saying that, you know, this isn't the exhaustive list, but if you're gonna jump into the fray, this is this is a good place to start. This is a good place to kind of get familiarized with the beginning, like this may be the beginning of it.
Yeah, and I think that is why, as I was going through it, I included, for example, the thing around don't talk to staff members, go to the superintendent first, right? Because I was like, even though that may be good governance more than ethics, I was thinking, what would a new board member need to hear and see? So I don't know, that's where I was, but I am open, because I wasn't sure what was right to highlight and what was not.
Well, maybe it's still the reference to, you know, as part of our commitment to being ethical and as a sort of stewards of this governance body, we agree to, and, you know, for example, and then highlight that, because I see why these, I see why, and I appreciate why these we'd want to highlight them. So maybe it's a, for example, so it's clear, and for additional reference, please see
Yeah.
something.
I like that. What do you, does
Yeah.
that seem, okay, yeah, that's, oops, I'm pressing that. I like that, because I think it's like, it's clear that it's not exhaustive, but here's some ones that you might want to really pay attention to,
Some key
because,
ones.
yeah. Okay, so that gets us through, that was 4 through 7, I think, because those are all sort of the same, all sort of part of our governance, good governance practices. Number 8 gets into the Brown Act, and I have to admit, on number 8, yeah, I included some things here and did not include others, and wasn't sure which one should be included or not. So again, this may be another one where we want to change what's here. Maybe we just want to say, follow the Brown Act. You know, I don't know.
I guess to our legal counsel, are there specific to the end I mean, I guess in the spirit of using this as not as a treatise, but to sort of highlight and surface some of the things that we really want to be most mindful of, are there certain things relating to the Brown Act that are like, you know, frequent violations or easy to violate inadvertently that would be worth raising up in this part?
Well, I think that what's listed here is most current in terms of today's world. In terms of today's board member of what I'm seeing in the real world. I do trainings at the state level at CSBA, as well as at the local level for districts that last hours on the Brown Act. We have the Brown Act book that we produce that is pages upon pages. And I could also print out the law, the opinions, like, so the Brown Act is a pretty deep, well argued well of the law that goes back to the 1960s. It's hard to point out or to raise one thing being more important than the other. I think a concept like social media, a concept like electronics. That's kind of the new frontier of, it's on the cutting edge of politics, communication to the masses. You know, in the old days, we didn't have these kinds of things. And I think it would come to it's not intuitive, right? Like, that's the other thing that I would, if there's anything to raise, it's the stuff that's not intuitive. Like perhaps something on social media and something about serial meetings, or like what a majority means, right? Like you're not allowed as a board member to speak to a majority of the board because you're initiating a potential problem with the Brown Act. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's the only reason I highlighted social media was because it is new, but yeah, I agree. I don't think it's not more important. In fact, it's probably less important, but it's because people may not know, and it seems a little strange, but there it is, right? And so, and it's pretty clear now. There's clear guidance, right?
And I remember when I was first appointed and got an overview on the Brown Act, it would not have been obvious that by liking a social
Right.
media
Right.
post that could be contributing to. So
Right.
I do, yeah, I appreciate that.
So, and we can, yes.
Sorry, but
ahead.
maybe here it would be like, for example, you know,
Mm.
this is another to make sure that it's not, that we're not suggesting this is the entirety of it. Or maybe maybe there's a preface in the beginning, which is, you know, there are examples provided in this statement, you know, this statement is not basically what I think you said, although I was 10 minutes late because of traffic, but something like that in the beginning to make clear that, you know, there are other things that we need to be mindful of.
Yeah.
I do think, you know, certainly we want to follow law, but there's also, I think, as representatives and of the community, overall, I feel like there's a value or ethics approach around open and public manner of
Mm.
how we do our work. So that's something that I think I would want to, we don't have the wordsmith at this, but
Yeah.
maybe something around kind of putting that first and foremost.
Yeah, I agree. That sounds great. And let's keep going. We can come back to these at any time. So numbers 9 is financial conflict of interest rules. That one, I think is pretty straightforward. I don't know what people think, but that's, you know, it talks about the Form 700 and that's all governed by law, right? And that's number 9. And then number 10, gifts and honoraria, which is also state law. And then number 11 gets into San Francisco's ethics rules. Now, we have, you know, our city has a really extensive and comprehensive ethics code, which is great. But there's a lot in there. And so I wasn't sure, again, you know, should we pull some of those things out or not? I kind of listed them there, but I don't know if that's sufficient.
I think it's helpful to list some of them. And I think what the other two things that I've noticed about both 10 and 11 are like, it's the responsibility of the board to know. I think that is key. And maybe it's to know and follow all ethical laws seated of that. These are just, again, the reference to these are just examples, like whether it's something that comes at the top and references everything or in each section.
Right.
And this is, like, for example, prohibition on contracting with the city, SFUSD, CCSF, or the housing authorities, like in our individual capacity.
Correct. Yeah, and our board policy pulls from the ethics code, but I don't think it quotes the whole thing. So even that 9270 kind of has all these things in it. But yeah, well, I guess it's pretty comprehensive, actually. But it may not be totally complete either, because it is not the ethics code. It's just our policy quoting the ethics code, so. Then number 12, number 12 is also part of the San Francisco Ethics Code, but I thought it was useful to pull out because it relates, I think, to the Council of Great City Schools rubric. So one of the items on the Council of Great City Schools rubric is the board has included language in the ethics and conflicts of interest statement requiring that board members fully recuse themselves from matters involving individuals, or organizations who made campaign contributions to them or who appointed them. This, now I don't know that this is exactly the same thing, but this is San Francisco's ethics code that is related to that topic, which says that board members must disclose any personal, professional, or business relationship with any individual who is the subject of, has an ownership or financial interest in a decision being made by the board. And then it says this rule applies if, as a result of the relationship, the ability of the board member to act for the benefit of the public could reasonably be questioned. So I take that to mean that, you know, if there was a distant connection or some sort of thing, that wouldn't necessarily, where it wasn't we wouldn't reasonably assume, oh, that board member might, you know, you wouldn't reasonably question it. You wouldn't necessarily have to disclose, but you would if there was any reasonable assumption of a not conflict of, I keep wanting to say conflict of interest, but it's not financial conflict of interest. It's this ethical connection.
It's like a bias.
Yeah, a
right?
bias. Thank you.
Yeah, I wondered about that, because we do have to approve publicly, employment of staff members. I'm wondering, where does that kind of fit in?
Well, yeah, and so like, I don't know, Memo, if you want to, if this is appropriate to comment on in this setting or not, but I mean, my assumption would be, you know, I have friends who are teachers or principals. I don't have to recuse myself from the consent item where they get their contract renewed because I didn't have anything to do with that. That's recommended by staff. It's sort of part of the process. And as a board member, we generally don't involve ourselves in those decisions. Is that just as an example?
So there's a couple of nuances to what's being discussed here. I don't read this requirement to say that you have to recuse yourself. I think it's more of just a transparency or a declaration that says, I know this person. And so if you read the language here from the beginning, San Francisco's ethics code requires board members to disclose any personal, and I'll delete the rest, right? Any personal relationship with any individual who is the subject of, so that would be employment, or has an ownership of or financial interest in a decision made by the board. It just requires disclosure. It doesn't require any further action. I don't, kind of where the ambiguity gets into it is like, well, how much is personal, right? Like, I know the person, I like the person, I've had a meal with the person, I'm their child's godfather.
Well,
You know
that's
what I mean?
why the second sentence there, which is also from the ethics code, isn't that kind of where it kind of gets into that? If the ability, if as a result of the relationship, the ability of the board member to act for the benefit of the public could reasonably be questioned.
Well, and that's what's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the law, which the law loves to say this word reasonable. And I'm not, yeah, I live with it every day. The problem is that reasonableness is measured by whom? The objective person, the common San Franciscan, and I'm not saying that like to be like smart about it, but I mean, seriously, that's how the courts will look at it. It's like reasonable who, like the reasonable member of FSUSD's public? Is it reasonable person in the United States? Is it reasonable person in what? I just say that because these things happen in a blink of an eye, right? Like the agenda comes up and all of a sudden you may have missed it and like, oh my God, I know John Doe, you know. One way to deal with that as I was once told as a young attorney, is you always have permission to do the right thing. You know, over declaring is not horrific. And it actually, you know, can be met with or embraced by folks as like, well, okay, well, that was cool. Like, I don't question so-and-so's ethics, but I appreciate that they declared what this was. I don't think that it's just literally like, I know that guy. I think it's, when they say personal, I interpret that to mean like, I regularly, before I was a board member, I regularly like had dinner with them, or like we hung out, you know, we grew up together, you know, something that is meaningful as opposed to just acquaintances.
Well, and my other part of the question was, you know, let's say we have that kind of relationship with a teacher. And we as board members have nothing to do with the evaluation process of teachers or whether they get jobs or that kind of thing. We do vote on them though, but it's on a consent item. So to me, I don't think, and again, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think most members of the public would think that board members are getting teachers jobs. But on the other hand, maybe somebody might think that, and maybe we should be disclosing that, right? But I mean, we can say that as board members, we don't, you know, that's not, we're very clear on separating our function from that of the superintendent. And I think we've gotten clearer as a board on that in the last year as well. So I think that also is just a question I have in terms of, but again, if what we ought to be doing is disclosing that anyway, as you're suggesting, over disclosing isn't a problem, then I think we should be clear about it as a board, like that is our expectation. So let's disclose it, you know, even if it's on a consent item.
Yeah, I always shy away from hard, fast rules. There's no such thing as one size fits all. I think the rule speaks for itself in the sense of saying like, it's gotta be all of these things. And, you know, it's up to each individual, like to say whether or not there's a close personal relationship with somebody and the board is making a decision about them. You know, I think there's nothing wrong with just saying like, you know, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, I'd like to just say I know Manuel Martinez and I'm just saying that for the record. It doesn't, you know, that and there's nothing that stops you from going further and saying, I don't think that this is like an issue for me, you know.
Well, or even in recusing ourselves. I mean, I think there's a couple of us we've done that in various cases where there might be a perception, even though I'm confident that there weren't any attempts to influence, but it was like, okay, I know this person, you know, maybe they're up for contract or something in the district. I'm going to say it and I'm going to even just not vote on it, right? Because we're allowed to recuse ourselves in that case as well, right?
Yes, and I mean, I also think of some uncomfortable scenarios such as student expulsions or, you know, discipline, employee discipline. And I think that there is a intersection between what I'm going to say or a primacy or a level of what takes priority. So for instance, if you had a scenario, an uncomfortable scenario where there was a confidential situation about somebody you know, well, you can't say, I know so-and-so publicly. You see what I mean? And, you know, as the attorney, I would be saying, well, if you're forced to choose, you're forced to choose the more authoritative source of law, which in this case is to maintain the confidences of it. I mean, we could work around like a declaration that also is maintained confidentially if we needed to check both boxes and say we're doing, you know, we're maintaining the confidentiality of all of it, but part of the confidential record is that board member X declared inconsistency with this, that they knew this person, you know what I mean? But we wouldn't, I mean, there's so many permutations that it's hard to land on a rule, which is why I think the drafters left it this way, right? That they were just trying to be commonsensical about it and not trying to make this, because as board members, you have successfully garnered trust of the public. You know people. They know you, they voted for you, right? I mean, I don't think that this is meant to be a barrier of any form. I think if anything, the spirit of this is just to inspire confidence that the decisions that are being made are being done so in the most objective way possible.
Just a point of discussion, you know, and this would be under the confidentiality, but to Manuel's point, when there are very difficult conversations related to employee discipline, ultimately if there are termination considerations, really difficult, again, confidential topics. I do think if in those confidential conversations, if colleagues do be forthcoming about those relationships, because those are generally progression over time. I don't know, that's just something that
Yeah.
I do want to raise, because certainly over the years, the biases that may come from the personal relationships, you know, again, within reason, but I just think that that's something to be aware of. And as individuals, for us to have that self-reflection enough that we are acting in the best possible on behalf of the district in our role.
So in other words, that we should be kind of ensuring that we're doing this. Yeah, I agree. Because I think this is an area where I think we have been very inconsistent. And sometimes people do it and sometimes people don't. And again, I'm not suggesting that anyone's trying to influence the process, but I think in terms of board members being aware of, oh, you know, I have a relationship with that person. I need to say it. I need to put it in the minutes, you know, so I think that's something we could do better at. Vice President Westmore, do you have any thoughts on this one?
I agree. I think, yeah, I agree. And I think sort of surfacing this and making sure we're elevating the conversation and awareness is really important.
Okay.
And I really like, just because San Francisco does have strong ethic rules, to be able to really bring this into the jurisdiction within the district, that it's very prominent, I think is really important.
Yeah, and well, so that kind of brings back to the Great Council of Great City Schools piece, whereas I don't know, it doesn't specifically say campaign donations, but to me, this would include that, because if there's somebody's made a donation to a campaign, and then you obviously have a relationship with them, right? So I don't know, and I'm a little wary of trying to adopt ethics rules outside of San Francisco's really strong ones. So I guess I just wanted to raise that question. And do we think that this addresses the issue around that's mentioned in the Council of Great City Schools rubric around campaign donations?
I don't have that pulled up right now. I will. Can you just read me that line?
Yeah, so it says, the board has included language in its ethics and conflict of interest statement requiring that board members fully recuse themselves from matters involving individuals or organizations who made campaign donations to them or who appointed them.
I think my concern here is like, what are matters? Like, is it? Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah,
think
it's
a lot of
phrased
us
differently.
are in, so I worry that it might cover things that that none of us will be able to vote on anything. It's my worry.
Well, right, so that's what I'm saying, like this language, that the Council of Great City Schools language is different.
Right.
It's said differently, but I feel like the spirit is similar, and I'm wary of, well, I'm wary of trying to adopt ethics rules that aren't San Francisco's ethics rules when we have a very strong local ethics code. For a variety of reasons. Like, I mean, Commissioner Lamb was just saying, like, I think we have this strong code locally. Let's say we're really going to do it. But anyway,
I'm comfortable with highlighting this extensive local ethics code.
Because to me, it would, and just to be clear, like, I think making a campaign donation or appointing someone is a professional, business, or personal relationship. Like, it falls in number 12. So it would be, that piece of it would, I suppose you could technically disclose it and not recuse yourself, but so that may be the only difference there. I don't know.
I guess so but it seems like you disclose it if as a result of the relationship, So it's not like, oh, I need to disclose every donor. I mean, it is available on a website, but, so I guess the question for me is, would we want to say Well, then we couldn't refer to the San Francisco Ethics Code. So right now, San Francisco's Ethics Code requires board members to disclose any personal, professional, or business relationship, and this sentence ends in a decision being made by the board. For purposes of SFUSD, a personal, professional, business relationship may be established through campaign contributions. I mean, I don't think it's necessary.
I'm saying I think that it already is included. I don't think we need to say it. Because I think it's obvious that if somebody gives money to your campaign, that's a relationship. Like they know you, they support you, right? I don't know what others think. But
Yeah, I think that we have a variety of, very good ideas drafted by a lot of different folks, but when it comes down to what fits for this board, you are free to decide what is the right blend, what is the right fit, what works for this community. I think that the language offered by Great City Schools is awesome, but when it gets to, applied here locally, if it starts kind of conflicting with some of these other concepts, you're going to have to choose between one or the other. And I can see many different ways where a requirement of a recusal based on a campaign contribution can absolutely go awry and actually be weaponized. So I don't know that, taking that final step is necessary when the spirit of what is being offered is equally stated in your local San Francisco policy.
yeah, and as you said earlier, I mean, then it might mean that we couldn't vote on lots of things. It might paralyze
At any
the
given moment, there's not a quorum.
Right.
for the vote.
right.
Or one of your enemies decides to donate to all 7 of you. No, I'm serious. Like if I don't think of what happens when things go right. I think of what happens when things go wrong, right? I mean,
That's the lawyer.
right. So I mean, if I wanted to take somebody off of my decision, I just, here's $100. It's worth its weight in gold. And
Then that assistant superintendent, we can never hold them accountable because they donated to all our campaigns and we can't vote on their contract.
exactly. And I
Right.
mean, I use these absurd, right? I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. I really am not. I think that there is using extreme examples or extreme scenarios to illustrate the point kind of crystallizes like, well, is the point to just get a board member off the decision? No, the point is to instill confidence that things are being done transparently and that decisions are being reached in a fair way. It's the outcome is for you to decide what works for you.
Yeah, I think just going back, given the San Francisco local ethic rules, the disclosures that we have to be consistent with, throughout our reporting, through our committees, I really do feel like that creates that has that transparency and it's more about than us holding ourselves accountable to following through what's in our policies as well as the statement.
I just had an idea. This is totally off the top of my head, so maybe it's not a good one, but you know how at the beginning of the consent calendar, there's a question, does the superintendent have any items to be withdrawn or corrected? What if we added a question, do any board members have items, relationships they'd like to disclose? So it's like a reminder, because I feel like part of what's happening is like, I think we haven't been in the habit of doing that. If we made it a more ritualized part of the meeting, it would remind us, we need to think about that and do it. I don't know, that's one thought.
That is a completely acceptable, I call it a reminder.
Yeah.
And whether it happens or not, like, as often as it can, I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying, we're just doing a quick check-in, making sure that we're going to be approving more than one item, most likely several items. Any like speak now, anybody, that's an opportunity. It could be a good prompt to just, keep things moving along.
And maybe, I mean, this might be getting into too much into the weeds, but instead of the superintendent gets the question directed to him, and then do any board members have any personal, professional, or business relationships that are the subject of any of these consent items, where that relationship will impact or may impact the ability to act. So it's like, you
Yeah.
gotta answer both as, because I think if it's, do we have any relationships, we're all gonna be like, well, actually, but that, it's the second part that matters more.
No, I totally agree. So it's where the ability of the board member to act for the benefit of the public
Yeah.
could reasonably be questioned. Yeah, I think that's, yeah. So then 13 is the rules on political campaign activity, which is again, just a part of the ethics code. Pretty straightforward, I think, but just a little reminder. So let me maybe come back to the whole picture, or should I first try to summarize what we've heard so far? In terms of, or do you all have things on your mind right now? Okay, all right, so let me try to summarize what I think I've heard that would need to be done between now and the next meeting before we finalize it. So one would be for item 2, we might want to pull some things out, including the confidentiality one. And maybe if my colleagues have specific suggestions on how to do that, they could send them to staff. So can we do that? Can we send them to you? And
Absolutely. Feel free to email them to myself. I'll be happy to work with the chair and we can figure out what's the best blend as long as you're comfortable with Commissioner Alexander making, some editorial decisions.
well, and we can always then change them at the next meeting. So but yes, trying to. Then the second, another one was around the word civility, which I agree with Vice President Weitzman-Ward. However, it is actually in our policies, which is why I put it there. So I don't know if we want to think about that, or so maybe that's something we could also just think about if we want to amend that.
I just wanted to add around the civility piece. I think overall, just given where we've been, I think where we're seeing across, the state and across the country, it's really around the respectful dialogue and overall decorum. So if it's matched or mirrored with civility and respectful dialogue, I think that's like the essence of this. And the importance of decorum. And, certainly that's also for the public as well. And, just across the street, the Board of Supervisors have recently adopted their own policy of eliminating public comment. Not that I am proposing that for remote, but I just think it was around the respectful dialogue and decorum that is really being confronted by school boards and just public entities.
Yeah, and I think when the civility thing came up before, there was a proposal to add some language that was much, much stronger. This was already in there, I think. There was just this kind of reference to it, which didn't trouble me as much. I forget how it was being proposed before the other time, but it was it felt different to me and more problematic, but.
And I think that's where the dialogue is key, right?
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
about shouting or the divisiveness, but because as board members and representatives of the community, we are committing to solving and arriving tough problems and arriving at solutions and the professionalism that absolutely needs to be led here at the highest level of the organization.
Yeah, and to be clear to everyone, this would apply to board members. This is not for the members of the public, because I think the other civility policy might have had to do with public members. This is also, anyway, so, but we can we can think about if we want to take that out or change it.
May I also just offer just a quick idea about, definitions and whatnot? These are your policies. So, but they are not created necessarily by you. The way that this actually gets made is you have a service through CSBA. You could change the policy today and through your subscription, get new policies in 5 years, which will just restore the changes that you just made. So I don't want you chasing your tail on that. One possible solution, which is not a perfect solution, is to adopt an independent board policy that just simply says throughout all policies here, civility shall mean this and it shall not mean that. I'm not saying that it's perfect. I'm not saying that it lands because people will still read what they read. But, you know, I don't want you to believe that if we spent a lot of blood and treasure trying to change this throughout thousands of pages, it will just go back to what it was in like 5-year, 10-year cycle, which is the way CSBA works.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful in terms of the practical realities of these, because, yeah. And again, what really matters is the lived experience of this, right? For us as board members. And so we don't need to be wordsmithing all this stuff. But, and again, this document is really intended for new board members and also for ourselves as a reminder and an overview of kind of where things are at. So
I do have a question around just like the way it's written, like, because if we're gonna have board members sign it, do we have to put in the correct person?
well, okay, so we had a conversation about this. I don't know if, should I say something about this? Okay. Well, I like the way you said it. So if you don't mind explaining it, why? Because I had originally drafted it more as like a commitment statement. And so I want Manuel to share his reaction, which I then agreed with. his analysis.
I mean, again, I am not the 8th board member. This is your tool. It's whatever works for the board. As the lawyer, I look at it from a different perspective because as we've said, and what I've heard mentioned many times is that there is a deep well of law, court cases, attorney general opinions that is holding up this structure, holding up all of these regulations and frankly, laws. Whether you sign it or not is irrelevant. You're bound by it. It's like, I don't have to have someone sign something to say, I promise not to steal. You're going to be held accountable if you steal. If you violate these ethics rules, if you don't file your Form 700, I'm not relying on whether you sign this or not. Like, and I don't think that the law enforcement or anybody else who enforces the rules is going to be intimidated or dissuaded. Like, they're not even going to be asking about that. So I think I just wanted to kind of frame the perspective of it is like, if you're going to sign it, it's more of it's a different thing as opposed to like a commitment. You know what I mean? It's not a binding contract in that sense. You're already bound by it once you took the oath to defend the Constitution and be a board member. So I just wanted there to be kind of like eyes wide open as to what it is that you're doing here. If this tool is on the other hand, designed to serve as a good guidepost to say, this is a good starting point. This is not exhaustive. These are some of the things that we'd like to raise now, and maybe we change it over time. But know that you're bound by all of this, even the stuff that's not listed.
So I do think it's helpful to have, I think I don't know, it didn't show up on this one, but I had put a spot for people to sign. So I think board member can still sign it, but it's almost more like I'm signing this it's like when you go to the doctor and they say, you know, can you sign this thing showing you got this paper, right? It's like, I've been made aware of this, you know, but you're bound by it regardless.
Atmospheric.
Right. Okay, so, but we can change the titles too. Like, I'm not sure they were the most eloquent. Like at first, you know, I had written, I will act in the best interest of every student, and I changed. So it felt a little awkward sometimes.
Okay.
So if y'all have suggestions also on how to make it sound better, please send those in. So the other thing I heard was, it sounds like numbers 4 through 7, we're gonna sort of combine into something around with introductory statements saying I'm gonna comply with with good governance practices. If you have specific ideas on how to frame that statement, if you could send that'd be great, or else take a stab at it. For number 8, the Brown Act, again, adding kind of you have to follow the Brown Act. For example, here's a couple things. Know about social media, know about serial meetings. Maybe we add that one. and framing it as like, we want to have an open and like, not, we don't just want to follow the law, but we agree with the law because it's about open and transparent meetings. Then as number 12, we talked about during that we would, well, maybe that's not even in number 12. That's just a separate recommendation that we might, the board might consider adding a thing in the meeting, asking a question if people want to make disclosures. So, but if other ideas come up, what I would suggest in terms of process is that if you both, and I can think about this too, can send Manuel our suggestions. And maybe right now we can talk about the next meeting date and a deadline for that. Then he can compile them and we can then form the next agenda based on those things. Be like, okay, here are the suggestions. Let's just go through them. Or here's an edited version. And then the next meeting can be quick wrap up.
Recommendation.
And then we make recommendations. We can vote and make recommendations.
To the full board. Okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yes.
So when should we, is that okay if we just do scheduling here? I know this is not our norm, but we could let this public see all of our. Is there a date in December that we could all agree on?
Yeah, early. The first week.
Would December 5th or 7th? 5th, 6th or 7th?
I'm here. I'm scheduled to be here on December 5 and December 7.
Okay.
And I also am available in the same time as this.
I cannot do the 7th, but I can do the 5th or the 6th.
I can do the 5th.
And 6 p.m. on the 5th? Vice President Wiseman Ward, okay.
Okay, so I think I just heard 6 p.m. on Tuesday, December 5th will be our second and likely final meeting of this committee, although we have the option to change our mind if we want to. Commissioner White.
And so when should we send our suggestions to Manuel? And then that would also require putting edits together, so that package, right, is ready for posting.
Right.
I was gonna say, if I may, actually, now that I look at it, I would ask Mr. Steele. So given that we are looking close to that Thanksgiving holiday, if this needs to be agendized on December 5, when would we comfortably need to get to you all the posting and materials to comfortably post for Brown Act?
December 1st.
Okay. So then I would,
Sorry, he said December 1st.
First,
Yeah, your mic wasn't,
Friday.
yeah, your mic wasn't on. I just want to make sure that,
Sorry.
it's okay. I want to make sure.
December 1st.
Yeah, I want to make sure the public can hear.
how does November 27 sound?
Yes.
Great.
And of course,
so-
that gives me flexibility. If you're late, it's not like, that's not like.
No. We're gonna hold
Okay.
ourselves accountable. We're not
Okay.
gonna be late.
There we go.
Don't give us an option of being late.
The
Okay,
27th
Monday,
penalty.
December 27th, no, Monday, excuse me, November 27th
Mhm.
by 5 p.m. Please. Suggestions. And then we can, then we'll have the agenda posted by that Friday and the meeting will be Tuesday, the 5th at 6 p.m. All right, any final comments, questions, complaints?
Thank you.
No, thank you again.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it. And thanks especially Manuel for your work on this and to my two colleagues. I am excited. And with that, this meeting is adjourned at 7:17 p.m.